Welcome to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Min Sun-hee with this week's discussion on news events with our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome back to the show. We missed you last week, Elise.
I missed you all too.
Right. Now, it's been a week since we've had you here. What are some of the stories you covered this week, Frank?
A couple of weeks ago I did a story about the influx of foreign students into South Korea. South Korea has more than 100,000 foreign students now. And I met up with an Iranian student that's doing a master's degree in fabric arts here. She showed me some of her beautiful work that reflects her experience in South Korea. Another story that I did was the Arirang festival at Gwanghwamun Plaza that took place over the weekend, and it was a really beautiful experience for me to do a couple of positive stories like that.
I see. What about you, Elise? What has been keeping you busy?
Well, NPR and obviously the globe is our entire globe is interested in what's going on with Samsung. We reported sort of the cultural place of Samsung in Korea and why change is really difficult for these chaebol.
I see. What about you, Marcus?
I went to Singapore to do reporting for a story on smart cities. In Singapore right now they're installing lots and lots of sensors and cameras all over the city. And they're going to monitor everything that happens in the city to try to make the traffic run smoother and improve on a lot of different things. But it also raises questions of privacy. And it's an interesting story because a lot of big cities in the world is trying to do what Singapore is doing, including here in Korea.
And in Korea we have...
There's Songdo here in Korea, right? I've been reporting quite a bit from Songdo as well. I did some stories from there. Which is also a very, very interesting place.
Right, I see. All right then, now every autumn the world awaits in anticipation for the list of laureates to join the ranks of other Nobel Prize winners. This year, of the 6 categories, that of literature secured much attention as the prestigious award was granted not to an author or a poet, but a musician, Bob Dylan. Up next, we take a look at this folk singer's songs and more.
Nobelpriset i litteratur år 2016 tilldelas Bob Dylan.
The announcement of a rather unexpected winner stirred up a lot of reaction from the global community. In the 116-year Nobel Prize history, it was the first time for a contemporary singer-songwriter to receive the award. Lyrics from popular music had received recognition as a form of literature. Bob Dylan, who is he? Since starting his career in music in the 1960s, Bob Dylan has been known as one of the most influential artists in the history of contemporary music. His music especially delved into social issues such as the threat of nuclear war, racism, and Dylan also was behind the anti-war movement, emerging as an icon of resistance. He's also known as a bard. His lyrics appear in literature textbooks in high schools and universities. And courses analyzing Bob Dylan's lyrics are also taught at American universities. From long ago, lyrics written by Bob Dylan had already been receiving literary recognition. The Nobel Prize Committee awarded Bob Dylan for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. The fact that a singer, not a writer, won the award did come as a great surprise, but many have called the decision inspiring.
Right, we are back here now. Are you familiar with Bob Dylan's songs?
It's hard to grow up and be culturally literate without being familiar with Bob Dylan.
Because you're from America, right?
Well, that's true, but I imagine he's popular all over the Western world at least.
In Europe as well.
In Europe as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Were you surprised when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature?
I was surprised just because I was expecting it to be Murakami, because there's been a lot of talk that this Japanese a Japanese author has been sort of overdue for a Nobel Prize in Literature. But, you know, Bob Dylan, obviously, really part of a vanguard in the late 20th century of really describing a lot of the tumult going on when it comes to social issues in the United States. And so very important in terms of history and as somebody who really documented change.
Right. Marcus, what are your thoughts on this?
I thought it was strange, and I thought it was a mistake by the Nobel Committee to award the prize in literature to Bob Dylan, because I know I do, and I think most people associate Bob Dylan with music. You know, he's a musician, a songwriter, a performer first, and then he's a poet and an author second. Ideally, the Nobel Prize in Literature should be awarded to literature in the traditional sense, so just words. And I think they failed to do that this year.
I see. Now, we will get back to the criticism, Marcus. But first, Frank, there is talk that it was the lyrics, it was Bob Dylan's lyrics that got him the prestigious award. Do you agree?
Well, you know, this is a story, I think that there's a lot of different perspectives that you can take on it. As a songwriter and as a lyricist, I think he's far ahead of anybody else. When he wrote a song, often they went through many, many drafts. Notebooks of his songs still exist, and they are worth, you know, a huge fortune. He recently sold his archives to the University of Tulsa for, you know, they say in excess of $10 million. He has 6,000 pages or something of drafts of his music. He didn't just, you know, pen a song on a napkin or something like that. The writing process for him was an intense, you know, undertaking. Also, there's a connection with him to the literary movement. He was friends with Allen Ginsberg, who appears in the background of Subterranean Homesick Blues. And Allen Ginsberg even says he feels like he's passing the torch to the next generation, and that Bob Dylan is a representative of this generation, and he calls Bob Dylan a great poet. And this is the leading American poet of the Beat generation of the 1950s and early 60s.
Right. Elise, if we take into account what Frank just said, could we assume that this latest event has essentially redefined perhaps the boundaries of literature?
I think we should always be questioning our definitions of everything, right? I mean, humans have a tendency to want to categorize, but why they exist are all constructs of our mind and constructs of society at any particular moment. And so, you know, why we want to put a musician in a category of only musician or primarily musician instead of writer or poet, when both of their contributions, both music and lyrics, could be equally important to one another, is something that the audience wants to do, right? It's something that we as an audience tend to have a tendency toward. But art is art. Art, I feel like what's beautiful about art and what's beautiful about music is that it speaks to people in a universal way that really transcends category and transcends definition.
Right. Okay, Marcus, all criticism aside, if you had to pick perhaps a singer, a lyricist, who you think would be equally as deserving of such recognition, is there anyone in particular that you have in mind?
I think if you had to give the Nobel Prize in Literature to a musician, you would have to give it to Bob Dylan. I mean, he's probably the most literary musician out there, right? And his body of work is so impressive, as Frank just said. But ideally, the Nobel Committee should be elitist. They have this great power to every year shine their light on an author and make that author and his or her work accessible to the world. And by awarding the prize to Bob Dylan, they haven't done that because he's already so recognized in the realm of music. He's so well known. So in that sense, I think the committee didn't make the right choice.
Yeah, I have to agree with and just comment on what you just said. One of the things that Leonard Cohen said, who's also very famous for his songwriting, was that this was like pinning a medal on Mount Everest for being the tallest mountain. Right. It's kind of ridiculous almost to give Bob Dylan this type of award, and in a way it demeans the award. I think one of the things that the committee is trying to do is to make the Nobel Prize relevant, for it to gain recognition and gain fame. Every now and then award it to somebody famous. Maybe the Nobel Committee is trying to, you know, increase its own sort of footprint, its own public relations, and generating a bit of controversy might help do that.
Right. Okay. Bob Dylan's winning of the Nobel Prize in Literature has secured rave reviews and also harsh criticism by those who were reportedly stunned by the unorthodox decision. Up next, we take a look at their thoughts.
Bob Dylan became the 2016 Nobel Prize laureate in literature, but some have asked whether he should be eligible for the award. As soon as Bob Dylan was announced the winner, the New York Times published an article under the headline, "Why Bob Dylan Shouldn't Have Gotten a Nobel." The author of Transpotting, Irvin Welsh, criticized the decision as well, suggesting people look up the definition of music and literature. The controversial reaction comes from the idea that the fields of literature and music should be kept separate. There has been analysis that the announcement of the prize in literature was delayed by a week because of strong disagreement among members within the Swedish Academy. Meanwhile, it was also pointed out that unlike the regular contribution the Nobel Prize in Literature makes to readership and book sales, this year this will not be the case. In order to understand Bob Dylan's literary value, one needs to listen to his music, not read his autobiography. In other words, it's the sales of albums that will be affected, not books.
확실히 유명하신 분이지만 이게 최근 앨범들이 솔직히 이게 반응이 크진 않았어요. 근데 그 이번 수상을 기점으로 몇십 배는 되는 것 같습니다. 주문량이.
Bob Dylan winning the Nobel Prize is considered to have expanded the scope of literature, but on the other hand, there is also the argument that the decision is a disservice to writers.
So the argument is Bob Dylan is a musician, a lyricist, yes, but not a writer. Now, what are your thoughts regarding the criticism? We've heard of Marcus's earlier on. We'll start off with you, Frank, first, and then we'll move on.
We need to sort of stretch the bounds of literature and also poetry. Poetry is a spoken word. You know, there is a strand of poetry that is just read on the page, but the stronger sort of strand or genre of poetry is a spoken word. Even when you read most poems on the page, you're sounding it out in your mind, and also the reading of poetry itself is very important. And even the South Korean poet Go-eun is well known for his reading of his own works and the charisma that he brings to those readings. So that sound is sort of part of the literary tradition of poetry, and that sort of needs to be, I think, recognized when we, criticize the awarding of Bob Dylan of this Nobel Prize.
There are those who argue that by having granted the award to a musician, the Nobel Committee essentially missed the opportunity to honor a writer in the traditional sense, like you were saying, Marcus. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree 100%. I think the great thing about the Nobel Committee is that they're able to highlight an author that very few people outside of the literary community has heard of. A relatively unheard of Chinese poet or a documentarist from Belarus, and say, look at this body of work that's being produced out here. This is something that readers around the world should pay attention to.
I see. Marcus, there are calls that Bob Dylan should then decline to accept this prize. How do you respond to that?
I would feel, if I was Bob Dylan, I guess I'd feel a little strange about being awarded with the Nobel Prize. Because you can see how he's responded in the past to similar awards. He was given a medal by President Barack Obama not too long ago, where he seemed very uncomfortable. If you look at the footage from the ceremony, I think Bob Dylan is an artist who's been trying to reinvent himself throughout his career, who's tried very hard not to be typecast into a role of a certain kind of musician or songwriter, and I would imagine that he's not comfortable with this award. That's what, that it seems that way, if you look at what's been going on over the past week.
Right, which is probably why he wasn't responding to the calls by the Nobel Committee.
He's not taking their calls, yeah.
Right.
And I think one of the things that we could say is kind of happening here also is a sort of protest figure is being appropriated by the mainstream and saying, oh, he's part of us. you have, major like Bill Clinton coming out and Al Gore coming out and congratulating him and things like this, and just the awarding of such an elitist prize to somebody who's really more of a protest figure, again, is kind of odd, and I think something that he might be uncomfortable with.
Right, that is an interesting perspective. We have the Fields Medal for mathematicians. We have other, the Grammy Awards for musicians. Should we perhaps, do you believe then that the Nobel Prize for Literature should be saved entirely just for writers? I mean, I'm sure we know where Marcus stands. Elise, what about you? Do you think we should make that differentiation between these?
I don't know what these the categories, how the categories are so tightly defined anyway, right? So I challenge the whole notion that Bob Dylan is not a writer. He absolutely is a writer. I challenge the notion that Jay-Z is not a writer or Common isn't a writer. So it just seems really strange that there's such resistance to somebody being out of their box, and that we as a society feel so strongly about putting people in their lanes. I just think that's what has kept a lot of progress from happening throughout history.
I see. Now, regardless of whether Bob Dylan's winning of the prize in literature means a blurring or broadening of the definition of the term literature itself, one thing is for sure: his nomination was met by surprise by quite a few people.
The Nobel Prize in Literature. Although various forms of literature exist in countries all around the world, past laureates have mostly come from the European continent or English-speaking nations. But since the 1970s, recipients have started to emerge from non-European and non-English-speaking nations as well. Korea's neighboring countries, China and Japan, have each produced 2 Nobel Literature laureates. Then, could this be a possibility for Korea? Back in May, news broke out that surprised not only people in literary circles, but also the Korean society as a whole.
그 당시에는 기쁘다거나 뭐 이런 생각보다 참 이상하다 뭐 이런 느낌 잘 들어오셨어요.
Author Han Gang won one of the world's top 3 literary awards, the Man Booker International Prize, with her novel The Vegetarian. This gave rise to the notion that Korean literature can also hold greater appeal for a wider readership around the world. Besides the works of Han Gang, many others are starting to see a following as well. Also, Ko-eun, one of Korea's most celebrated poets, has long been nominated for the Nobel Prize. This is why many hope that in the near future, Korea will see one of its writers win the prestigious award as well.
For this year's Nobel Laureate in Literature, there were a few names that Elise, you mentioned one of them, Japanese writer Haruki Murakami, and Korean poet, of course, Ko-eun, as well as Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Do you have any favorites, any one person in particular that you believe deserves to win the Nobel Prize but hasn't yet been able to secure one?
I think Murakami is definitely a candidate that a lot of people think has been overlooked for some years now. Ko-eun also comes up. I work for a weekly newspaper, and our deadline is Thursday afternoon every week, and the Nobel Prize always comes out on a Thursday afternoon. So we always have about an hour or an hour and a half to write about this year's winner. So each year I'm given the job of getting ready to write about Ko-eun should he win.
Oh wow!
So I'm ready to have an hour to write a profile on Ko-eun. Yeah, I think a lot of people would like to see Murakami, and then definitely a lot of people in Korea would like the recognition from the Nobel Committee, which they haven't had yet.
Right, for Ko-eun, right?
Yeah, for Ko-eun.
Right. Frank, what about you?
Well, I'd have to agree with Marcus about Ko-eun being a likely candidate. It's interesting to see the sort of protest relationship between him and Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is a protest figure, but the life and times of Ko-eun were much more tumultuous. I mean, he was tortured and jailed during his lifetime, and his body of work is, of course, much larger than Bob Dylan's and confined to true literature. So I think that makes him even perhaps a stronger candidate for a pure elitist award. than perhaps Bob Dylan. And as I mentioned, there were other motivations, I think, at play in awarding Bob Dylan the prize, certainly, and there's a lot of bias involved in the awarding of any of the Nobel Prizes.
Right. There are views that more than 80% of the Nobel laureates are from Western countries. There is a disturbing inequality, according to some critics. How do you respond to this, Elise?
Well, you can argue that there's kind of a Western-centric bent to a lot of things, but we have to keep in mind that the Nobel Prize is a Western award. It originated in the West, in Sweden, and so this isn't a huge surprise based on history. Obviously, you know, there's a lot more campaigning going on now for the Nobel, which China famously engaged in some sort of 30-year campaign to try and win its Nobel Prize in literature. And so we're seeing a lot of Eastern countries try and catch up in that sort of, in the campaigning front, though it's arguable whether you should try and campaign for an award in the first place.
Earlier this year, Korean writer Han Gang received the Man Booker International Prize for her novel, The Vegetarian. Are you familiar with this book?
I read a little bit about her winning of the prize, and I think that gets back to sort of what Marcus said. That prize is much more awarded to for literature. Something like 150 books were considered for the prize. It was narrowed down to a short list of 6, and her book was chosen unanimously out of those 6 through an evaluation of the literature itself. No other issues or biases, I think, were really involved in that, and that represents, I think, more what Marcus is looking for out of the Nobel Prize, which, you know, has been accused of being quite biased.
Right. Last year, the Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded to Belarusian journalist and author Svetlana Alexievich. What are your prospects, do you believe, of perhaps securing a similar award in the future, way out in the future?
Well, I was a literature major, but I tore up my poetry a long time ago. So I don't have any aspirations along those lines, certainly.
I don't like to write more than 2,000 words.
Okay.
Okay, that makes sense. What about you?
I don't think I'm going to win the Nobel Prize in Literature anytime soon. But I think it's great to have these kinds of awards to aspire to. If you're a young author, you might dream of one day winning the Nobel Prize. If you're a journalist who's just getting into the field of journalism, you might aspire to win a Pulitzer Prize one day. In my home country of Denmark, we also have a prize for the best journalism of the year that you might aspire to win. I think it's great to have these institutions that try to be unbiased and just look at the work that's being done and award people who deserve it.
Right. According to the Oxford Dictionary, literature is defined as written works, especially those of superior or lasting artistic merit. Now, granted, the definition of the term literature may not change, but the format of expression and the words used to make those expressions may change to reflect the flow of time and that of society. Right, but before we end today's discussion, perhaps a few words on your thoughts.
Well, I think you know, Bob Dylan is a great artist. I think he deserves a lot of praise. And I think he's gotten that praise. I don't think he should have been awarded with the Nobel Prize. I think that award should have been given to an author or a poet, and preferably someone who wasn't well known to begin with. So that award would help him get a larger audience and would help readers around the world get new experiences in literature.
Right, Elise, what about you?
My take is awards are largely subjective anyway. I think it would be unfair not to call Bob Dylan a poet, and so good on him. Congratulations to him, and hopefully he comes out to receive it.
I feel for how Marcus feels about this award being given to a famous musician, but I think that we need to separate Bob Dylan from just putting him into that classical sort of box of being a musician. He was much more than that, and a poet is one of the things that he still is. I also think the Nobel Committee is trying to get a little bit of PR for itself to make the award maybe a little bit better known and recognized with popular society in popular culture.
Right. And on that note, we end this edition of Foreign Correspondents. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next week, same time.